One thing I've learned having lived in the US and the UK is that the American dream is real, but the
genuine question, why are the salaries in the UK so low? You know, every time I have to hear about an American...
Americans will look at a European with a straight face and tell them they're living paycheck to paycheck. Whole time they're making $70,000 a year.
Fuck knows.
If Britain was an American state, if we were the fifth...
Asking New Yorkers their salaries, because ours are dead.
Well, I work retail. What we say before?
125.
125.
As a British guy, there is one thing that Americans have that we don't. In America, people have ambition. When you start...
Wait, is this actually true? Thousands of foreigners are discovering a shocking reality they never expected. The average Brit often earns far less than the average American doing similar work. Even people who thought the UK and the US had similar living standards are stunned when they see the numbers. But the salary difference is only the beginning. By the end of this video, you'll understand why so many visitors say this completely changed how they see both countries. Before we continue, hit subscribe right now, because this channel uncovers surprising facts the mainstream rarely talks about, and you don't want to miss the next eye-opening comparison. Now, let's reveal what has everyone talking.
One thing I've learned having lived in the US and the UK is that the American dream is real, but the British dream does not exist. I was shocked to learn that the average salary of a student coming out of university here is 30 to 36k pounds, which if you convert to US dollars is only 50k, whereas in the US it's around 80k. And I myself was making six figures coming out of college. But the reason why I say the American dream exists and the British dream is not real is because even if you're making less than six figures in the US, at least you have line of sight or progression to achieve that eventually, even if you're a truck driver or work at a retail store like Target or Walmart. Whereas in the UK, I've seen people work at the same company for 15 to 20 years and not even get to 2/3 of 100k. But even if your salary increases here in the UK, you're just getting taxed even more. So you're not actually taking home any of the money that you've made. And that's the problem in the UK. It is a system that does not reward hard work. And that's why so many people are moving to cities like Dubai, where you don't get taxed anything. So unless you're working in some high-paying job like tech, consulting, finance, or law, I really struggle to see how you're even making a living to pay for your family, pay for your kids' tuition, etc., etc. And the problem is, the system is never going to change. The UK cannot afford to lower taxes, and companies here cannot afford to be paying their employees more money. So that is the sad reality of living in the UK.
A genuine question, why are the salaries in the UK so low? You know, every time I have to hear about an American salary, my mouth drops. My jaw is open. Pause. Heart sinks to my stomach, realizing how underpaid we are. These guys are talking about 100k a year as a truck driver, 200k a year as a lawyer, as a doctor. We're lucky if we get a quarter of that.
Even the numbers don't make sense. How are Americans just on another level economically? 76k a year GDP per capita. Ours is 30k less. Where's the money going? Why is our economy so shit? And this is per capita. Don't come to, oh, they have more people. Yeah, you bastard. This is per capita. Economics 101. Idiot.
Sorry, I'm just frustrated that when I go into work, my salary is probably going to be like 30% less compared to the same guy doing the same job in America. How's that fair? I'd get it if it was like with some war-torn third world country, fair enough, then innit, like salaries are going to be lower. We're both developed first world countries.
Americans will look at a European with a straight face and tell them they're living paycheck to paycheck. Whole time they're making $70,000 a year, paying half the taxes that we do. And I don't get it. Like, listen, I'm not trying to be insensitive. Obviously, I know there's plenty of people in America that are making a lot of money. But if I have to hear one more American who's making close to or at six figures complain about the quality of their life, maybe it's different over there. I don't know. I've never been to America. But like, the salaries I hear in America are crazy. Like, you guys cannot be struggling. What's the difference between the US and the UK that makes it so difficult to live in the US with these crazy high salaries? Like 30 to 40k in the UK is almost standard. I think I might make another video on this because UK salaries are almost like university 30 to 40k. I don't know why. We've decided that's like the number we want to set all the salaries at. Because obviously this video isn't talking about people. Listen, if you're making $20,000 a year, obviously completely understand why I live paycheck to paycheck. But like, I've genuinely seen people on here who are from New York, who are making like 80K a year, 90K a year, or dollars, and they're saying they're struggling. And it's like, no one's expecting you to be living on a yacht, but struggling. Explain it to me. I've got my...
Fuck knows.
If Britain was an American state, if we were the 51st state, how many states do you think would be richer than us and how many poorer than us per capita?
Fuck knows.
Do you think we're richer than any states?
So I think we're probably in the middle.
Interesting. So it's like sort of 25 out of 50.
Yeah, I'd say in the middle.
Because that a lot of people say that. Unfortunately, it's not right.
Oh, right, okay.
So there's been a new study by the Institute of Economic Affairs. The UK is now poorer per capita than all 50 American states.
Is it?
Yeah, we've been overtaken.
Shit.
We've been overtaken by Mississippi, the poorest American state. But what's really interesting is there was a survey done by the same group, 3,000 British voters. The average answer was they thought we would be the 7th richest state if we were an American state. We'd actually be the 51st.
Wow.
So it's a huge. I mean, your guess was actually significantly better than like the average British public. So there's a huge gap.
I think I wanted to say lower, but I was being over optimistic, hoping that it was. Yeah, hoping that Britain was better than it obviously, clearly.
Asking New Yorkers their salaries, because ours are dead.
Well, I work retail. What we say before?
125.
125, that was 125.
Yeah?
Okay, so I am a lawyer that's specializing in copyright and intellectual property.
And how much do you earn a year from your job? 6 figures?
Yeah.
How high up are you in retail?
Well, I'm in the shoe department.
I'm an entrepreneur. I make about like maybe 90K a year.
Whoa. Is that a lot of work?
Very hard.
Yeah?
Every day, every other day type shit.
What is your job in New York City and how much money do you earn from it a year, bro?
I'm a bud tender and I make roughly like $500 to $600 a week.
So 24,000, okay. And you're a musician as well?
Yeah, probably lose my money.
I worked as a residential assistant, like an RA, up in Binghamton University.
And what is an RA?
Basically like the dorm rooms. Like I was just in charge of like the floor.
And how much money did you earn a year because of that, lad?
18.5, something like that. Didn't really go into my bank account, but it went towards covering the costs of like university. So I got room, board, and my meal plan for free.
What shocked foreigners even more wasn't just the paychecks. It was what those paychecks could actually buy. Many expected Britain and America to feel almost identical financially. But after comparing salaries, career opportunities, and everyday life, they realized the gap was much bigger than they imagined. Some admitted they had believed stereotypes for years until the facts completely changed their perspective. If you're enjoying honest comparisons backed by interesting facts, subscribe now, because every video reveals something that challenges common assumptions and sparks fascinating discussions. Stay with us until the very end, because one final comparison leaves even long-time travelers completely speechless and changes the conversation forever.
As a British guy, there is one thing that Americans have that we don't. In America, people have ambition. When you start doing well in America, people support you. When you start doing well in the UK, people try and humble you. People in the UK, they don't like talking about success and they don't like supporting their friends. In America, you can bet your bottom dollar most people are going to support you. They're going to big you up. They're going to give you ideas. They're going to try and help you. In the UK, it's completely the opposite. Everybody wants to try and bring you down a peg. Nobody wants to see you succeed. And I don't get it. There's enough wealth to go around for everybody. Helping somebody else will always help you in the long run. And I feel like Americans know this. Americans know that there is such thing as good karma and such thing as bad karma. So be nice to everyone. Help your friend if they're trying to make a business. Stop being a bar humbug. People from the UK, yeah? I'm looking at you right now. Learn from the Americans. Be more American. Be more ambitious. Be more, let's go and get after it, instead of being like, nah, you're not doing it right. Yeah, you're too big for your boots. Nah. Nobody likes people like that. Yeah? No one.
A big difference between the US and the UK that really has a lot of thoughts and emotions around it is the difference of salaries. And I was talking about this the other day with my cousin who was visiting from San Francisco, and he was asking like, how the hell do people survive on UK salary? Because I would say it's a pretty commonly known thing that UK salaries are really low for the cost of living that we have here. But what I will say is, even though sure, if I was living in America doing the same job I have now in the same industry, I might be making more. Guess what? My industry was just slashed in America. I work in renewables, so my job would not be as secure. I would be working in a country where there are mass layoffs all the time and almost no workers' protections. I would have to pay co-pays for my health insurance. I would be worried about bankrupting myself if I had a severe health issue, all of this stuff. So even though the salaries here are way lower, and I'm not refuting that at all, they are way lower, especially when you're comparing to cities like San Francisco. I think what you get for a way lower salary is kind of similar. The one area where I think it's different is actually in terms of kind of housing. So for example, a lot of my friends in the US at this point might already be either living alone or living in just nicer apartments that are bigger. They have either no roommates, less roommates. They're able to just live with their boyfriend or partner. And in London, that's not nearly as possible at this age yet. Like, I don't know anyone in London my age that lives alone. Whereas I know people in the US that do that. Even though I could be making more money in the US, like, it's really just not that much of a pull factor to me. Because any sort of salary you get in the US, I feel like just has a whole contingency on it. The fact you could get laid off at any time, there's no workers' protections, and not to mention, the annual leave you get is actually a joke. I get 28 days of annual leave, and those are precious to me. You think I'm gonna go down to 10 days? Hell no. So even though the salaries are less here, I still think it works out to be somewhat similar in terms of lifestyle, and honestly, a bit better here. What do you think?
A genuine question, why are the salaries in the UK so low? You know, every time I have to hear about an American salary, my mouth drops. My jaw is open. Pause. Heart sinks to my stomach, realizing how underpaid we are.
As hilarious as this guy is, there's nothing funny about Brits watching American salary transparency videos. See, the average Brit earns about 30% less than the average American, even though our rent is almost 30% more. It's almost insulting then to find out that the average American property has 60% more space than its partners across the pond. But many millennials and Gen Zs in the UK have given up on owning any property at all, as the average house price has risen exponentially faster than the average salary. And I know doctors are better off than average, but I was watching one of those American salary transparency videos and I saw that a US emergency medicine physician was earning more than $35,000 for just doing his shifts, whereas me in London, I would have to wait more than a decade to even think about buying a property that I wanted if it wasn't for my social media income. Now, it's taken me around 8 years to generate this, but it's wild compared to my NHS income, which when I was working full-time as a final year junior doctor, I was making just above $6,000 every single month, and now I can make above $17,000 doing things like brand deals, getting YouTube ad revenue, and from TikTok as well. Now, it should not be like this, but sadly this is our reality. So if you want to find out how I actually started to build my social media profiles to make this, then I could probably charge you for it, but I'm going to give you my strategy for free during my live 3 Secrets webinar, but spaces are limited, so sign up in the link in my bio right now.
If Britain was to become the 51st state, how many states would we be richer than? How many would we be poorer than?
Oh, that's fun. Do you know?
I reckon we'd be in the top 10.
You reckon?
I reckon we'd be in the top 10, yeah, because I feel like London's got a lot of business going on. It's got a very flourishing capital, do you know what I mean? It's like if you look where we are now, lots of tourists.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, I'd say about top 10 definitely, yeah.
That's interesting. What about you, June?
Because I like the number 2, I'm going to say top 22.
Top 22. That's nice and even.
Yeah,
I've got some bad news. We would be the 51st, the poorest. If every single American state, including Mississippi and Alabama, which are the poorest states, are now richer than Britain on a per capita basis. So per person. Yeah.
Oh wait, that doesn't make sense.
But what's interesting is there was a big survey done, and most British people think that we would be number 7. So 3,000 British people were asked, and the average number was we would be number 7, which is pretty much what you thought.
Yeah, I said 10. Yeah.
And so you were actually more accurate than the average British person.
Okay, what was your average take home? And over here, was your average take home, if you don't mind?
So in the UK, my average take home for 4 weeks was around 1,800.
1,800
after tax.
After tax.
And here, my average take home after tax for 4 weeks is about 5,500.
Wow.
Yeah.
And what about bills?
Do you know one thing? When I was coming here, I heard a lot of scary stuff about bills and taxes. And I'm like, how bad can this be from what I'm seeing in UK? Because I felt my bills were just too much. And then I got here and I moved to my house, like my apartment. So I was like, I told my manager, where is my bill? He was like, oh, don't worry, the company will send it to you, blah, blah, blah. I said, okay, fine. And the bill came for 1 month and our gas was $16 for 2 people. Gas. 16. Imagine I cook like something.
Wow.
I always, like I'm literally cooking every day.
Have you been scared ever since you came here about the gun violence or about the crime rates here?
Honestly, because I used to take a lot of strolls with my husband when we were in the UK. Even like 11 p.m. we used to stroll back in the UK. And then one time we decided to just take a stroll just around our community. And it was just us, and it was 6 p.m. As soon as we started strolling, we saw a man with his gun. Like, I was like, what? Is it just like that? People are flaunting their guns. I was like, so we had to just end the stroll and go back. And since then, I've not been able to stroll. But knowing me, I'm somebody who would love to come out and enjoy fresh air. But now it's limited to my balcony.
So that means you're not as free as you were in the UK?
I'm still free, but I'm very careful.
Okay.
And how I'm careful because of all the things I've heard and all the things I've seen.
Okay.
It might not necessarily be the same. It might be an exaggerated stuff that we've seen, but just to be on the safe side, I prefer to stay at home.
I don't think people realize how poor the UK really is. And I saw this chart the other day in the Financial Times, which is Britain's largest financial newspaper, that really paints the picture. This is looking at GDP per capita already adjusted for purchasing power, and it compares the UK, Germany, Netherlands, and the US. Now, the blue line is the national average GDP per capita. So you can see between Britain, Germany, the Netherlands, and the US, the UK is already the poorest of the group at a national income around $45,000 per capita, compared to the US, which is around $65,000 per capita. That's already a pretty large gap. Now, the Financial Times asked the question of what would happen if you took the most productive city away from that country. So in the US, that's San Francisco, the Netherlands, that's Amsterdam, Germany, it's Munich, and the UK, it's very obviously London. And the differences are stark. So you can see over here in the US, if you take away San Francisco, the US's average income adjusted for purchasing power drops slightly. And you obviously have Mississippi here at the bottom. And I know it seems weird to compare a city to a full state, but San Francisco, the metro area, actually has more people than the state of Mississippi, so I'm fine with that analysis. The Netherlands, it's a larger drop. Germany, there's pretty much no difference. Munich is substantially wealthier than a lot of other cities, but it doesn't have a large share of Germany's population compared to some of these other places. And then you have the UK. If you took away London, which is by far the largest population hub in the UK, the average person in Britain is poorer than the average person in Mississippi. This says a few things. One, the UK is way too concentrated in one geographic area. London is really the only productive part of Britain on a global scale. You think about cities like Manchester, Liverpool, they just don't compete. I'm not an expert on British economics, but a lot of this is similar to what you see in like Rust Belt cities. And these are former manufacturing towns that just don't have the productivity anymore. It's really concerning, and this is when you see, trends like Brexit, where there was a vote where London was heavily in favor of staying with the EU, but the rest of the UK voted against staying in the EU and they wanted to leave. There's a huge mapping to the economic outcomes and realities all these people are living. To be clear, things can change. This is from an economics paper comparing the USSR, Germany, France, and the UK. And you can see in the 1960s and 70s, the UK actually did fall behind and was pretty much at parity with the Soviet Union. And then after the 1970s, it caught back up to its German and French peers. One thing I do find funny though is that in British press, they have this really bad, thought of Mississippi. And so a lot of them wrote, what? Like, are we as poor as Mississippi? And an American journalist wrote, is Mississippi really as poor as Britain? Which I love. So while I do love poking fun at the Brits, we do need our allies to be strong and healthy and have a great economy. And so I do hope that they can turn it around.
I lived in London and the US for 10 years. Here are my thoughts on which one is better. If you want to make more money, I'm going to give it to New York. Salaries in the UK are just abysmally low, no matter what you're doing compared to the US. And the cost of living is only slightly lower in London, even though you pay a lot more in taxes. New York has more opportunities job-wise to begin with. In terms of having fun and activities, I'm going to give this to London. London just has the most variety of things that you can do in any major city that I've ever lived in. Pub culture here is great, the running communities are a very big thing, and there are many, many parks here in London, whereas New York just has Central Park. I find that in New York, the only way to have fun is really to go out clubbing or to the bars every single week, which is, if you don't drink, very boring, and it gets boring even if you do drink anyway. In terms of food, I'm going to give this to London again. It comes as no surprise given that all the food in the US is super unhealthy and unnatural. But the UK food scene is actually incredible in terms of the diversity of cuisine that you can actually get and the caliber of it. It is some of the best tasting food in the world. As New York, you just got bacon, egg, and cheese, chopped cheese, $1 slice. And then in terms of diversity of people, I'm going to give it to London. I think this is a big thing that I really like. It's because in the US, I always found myself hanging out mostly with Americans, but in the UK, I can hang out with my Middle Eastern friends, my British friends, my Indian, Pakistani friends, and that's a level of diversity that you don't really get in the US or in most major cities. Overall, I am personally going to give it to London, but it really depends what you want in life. If you're someone who really wants to work hard and make their money, then I would recommend New York. But if you're someone who just likes a little bit more balance in their life and still make some money, then I would recommend London. Obviously, a very simple analysis, so don't go flaming me in the comments, but those are my thoughts.
On paper, the average American is nearly twice as wealthy as the average Brit. A large number of articles in British media over the last few years have focused on a GDP per capita gap between the UK and the United States as a justification for why the UK should become a little bit more like America, deregulating its markets, financializing more of its assets, privatizing its national industries. But today, I'm going to break down every single part of those numbers to show you the real comparison on an even basis. I'm also going to give you a better comparison, which would be Germany. Hi, my name's Henry, I'm a former wealth manager and economist, now based here in Switzerland. Right, let's break into the raw figures. Americans on a GDP per capita basis produce about $86,000 per person. In Germany, that's $55,000 per person, and the UK sits behind at $47,000 per person. This is the figure that they always lead with, and the gap looks pretty massive. America is nearly double the rate of the British GDP per capita. Now, on a dollar basis, this is true. However, if you want to compare the standard of living and the quality of life, what that money actually means in those economies, you have to adjust this on purchasing power parity, PPP. When you look at America, a lot of its prices are generally higher for equivalent goods. UK and Germany generally have lower relative price levels. On top of that, in currency strength, the US dollar is relatively quite strong when compared to the pound and the euro. Once we adjust for PPP, look at the gap now, substantially smaller already. The United States still sits there at approximately 86,000 per head, the UK jumps all the way up to 67,000 per head, and Germany sits along at 72,000 per head. I'll run a nice graph at the bottom, using America as 100 just for relative comparison. Now on to the second issue. GDP per capita is a standard mean average. You just take the GDP divided by the number of people. So when you look into the data here, if you have an extraordinarily wealthy 1%, it flatters the rest of the distribution and makes this average look quite a lot higher. Now in America, the top 1% of earners take 22% of the incomes. In the UK, that number is just 13%, which is quite a huge difference. So now when you're comparing the 99% of the population, not just the 1%, the wealthiest in the nation, look at where the index has moved to now. Now suddenly the gap is pretty small. The Americans are sitting at 100, and the UK is sitting at 80. That's a 25% gap from the UK to America. Now in this comparison, I've also been slightly overly fair with the Americans, because there's one type of transaction which overstates their GDP, which we don't have in the UK, and that is the cost of healthcare. Now in the United States, they spend 17.6% of their GDP on healthcare. We've all seen the stories about how expensive an ambulance ride is. This is included in GDP. For the UK, as the factor that we spend on the NHS, it's about 11.5. This also results in a life expectancy in the United States which is 2 years shorter than that in the UK. Now suddenly that gap doesn't look as large as they've all been talking about. But the real damning comparison is when you compare us to Germany after applying these modifiers. When you adjust the German data for a true fair comparison between the United States, the UK and Germany on a GDP per capita basis, with America indexed at 100, Germany is now landing at 95. Now in all these posts that they make about the UK being so far behind America because we're too regulated, or we're overly nationalised, or we have too much government intervention, they never mention Germany because it really breaks this narrative. Because Germany, in a lot of these effects, is the exact opposite of America. It has very strong state institutions. It has a very good social safety net. Yet look at it compared to America. And the worst figure, when you really go into it, is look at the hours that are worked. An American worker on average works approximately 1,800 hours a year. But when you look at Germany, they work 1,300 hours a year. So in a real head-to-head comparison, the Germans are only 5% behind the Americans while working nearly a third less hours. And so when you hear in the media this manufactured opinion with warped data, the idea that the UK must continue to deregulate, privatise its industry, they're only showing you one half of a pretty bad comparison. But at the heart of this data, there is still one real gap, that 80 versus Germany's 95. And that gap, would you believe it in a Henry Fudge video, is caused by the rentier black hole. Now that gap that you see between us and Germany, the real comparison, that gap, that is another fingerprint of the rentier black hole. As we said before, for the UK, where its capital nearly always ends up is property. The vast majority of our bank lending sheets goes back into property. The values and the assets that we own are disproportionately allocated into property. That's the black hole. Everything that could have been a productive investment is sucked into the land and our housing. And so what simply happens is that we don't have the capital, the big machines, the infrastructure that Germany has, because they're not wasting their money on buy-to-lets. They're investing in their infrastructure and their manufacturing. And you can see that really clearly in the data when you look into the amount of capital per hour worked a British worker has compared to a German. The easiest way to think about this is what tools does he have around him to work with in his production. Now for the UK, that figure is $128 per hour worked, but the peer average, with Germany included, is about $190 per hour worked. That is a third less capital. Once you understand that figure, it's very easy to see why we lag behind Germany on productivity. The best example would be, go down to a building site right now, pick up a toolbox, dump 1/3 of it on the floor, kick it into the sand. Now go try and build the house at the same rate. You can't. Now that gap in capital per hour worked is the ultimate fingerprint of the rentier black hole. That capital doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes from reinvestment. Now in the UK, our reinvestment doesn't go back into manufacturing. It doesn't go back into production. It doesn't go back into infrastructure. It goes back into our housing market. When you look at Germany, however, they have huge structural state-backed institutions to guarantee and ensure that their production has continuous investment. At the same time, in Germany, the mortgage lending is far more restricted using the Pfandbrief system. They break the pro-cyclical credit creation system by valuing the properties on their balance sheet at their long-term averages, not at whatever it's been marked up to today. And so that means when German companies make a pound, it goes back into expansion and production. When British companies make a pound, it goes out as dividends and buys a buy-to-let. And for British banks, we're looking at 80 to 95% of their balance sheet is going back onto mortgages. When you look at German banks, 30 to 40% of their balance sheet is going back into corporate loans. Now that process, every single year, the gap between us and Germany, where we invest approximately 18% of our GDP back into the economy on long-term average, and they invest 22%, doesn't sound like a huge difference, but the structural gap that we have to our peer economies is 2 trillion in missing capital. So the next time you see an article comparing the wealth of America compared to the UK, you have to ask the question of why are they trying to measure us to the United States? Because once you account for inequality and a slightly strong currency and their slightly higher price level, the gap isn't so large. The real gap, the real peer we want to compete with is Germany, not the United States.